All right, so you know how we're always saying that to ace those UPSC exams, you got to stay ahead of the curve.
Always.
Well, today,
Yeah.
we're doing a deep dive into something that's going to be huge, especially for anyone aiming for those top ranks. We're talking about India's new data protection scene.
Definitely a hot topic.
And we've got some fresh, hot-off-the-press material to dig into the draft. Digital Personal Data Protection Rules 2025.
Straight from the Digital Data Protection Act of 2023.
Yeah, this stuff is important, right? I mean, it impacts everyone, not just for the exam, but like in our everyday lives. Businesses, individuals, the whole digital economy is going to feel the ripple effects.
Oh, absolutely. And understanding these rules, it's not just about scoring well on the mains, it's
Yeah.
about understanding how the digital world is changing, how our rights are evolving. It's going to be relevant whether you're analyzing policy or, even just navigating those tricky MCQs in the prelims.
So let's break this down a bit. First things first, can you give us a quick reminder about the DPDP Act itself? What's it all about?
Sure. Think of it as a balancing act, really. The act is trying to protect your personal data. That's the core of it.
Okay.
But it also recognizes that data needs to be used, for things to work, for legitimate purposes. And this actually ties back to something super fundamental in our Constitution, Article 21, the right to privacy.
Very nice.
The DPDP Act is basically extending that right into our digital lives.
Makes sense. So these draft rules are basically like the instruction manual for making the act a reality, right?
Exactly. And one of the things that really jumps out, especially if you're thinking about policy analysis, is how they're dealing with children's data. Social media platforms.
Yeah.
They're going to need verifiable parental consent for kids to even create accounts. We're not talking about just clicking a box anymore.
Wow.
They'll have to actually validate parents' identities, might even involve using government IDs.
That's a big change. I remember when we were kids, it was like the Wild West online.
Oh, totally.
Anything goes. But there's an exception to this parental consent rule, right? I remember reading something about that.
You're right. Good catch. Healthcare, education, childcare facilities, they don't need parental consent for kids' data.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, think about it. Imagine a hospital needing parental consent in an emergency.
Oh, right.
It could be a disaster. So it's all about balancing, right? Protecting children, but also making sure they have access to essential services.
Makes you think about all the things policymakers have to weigh when they're crafting these rules. It's not simple.
Not at all.
Okay, so we've talked about kids, but what about the rest of us? Who are these data fiduciaries we keep hearing about?
Okay, so a data fiduciary, in simple terms, is any entity, any organization that handles your personal data.
Okay.
You're the data principal, they're the fiduciaries.
Got it.
It could be a massive company like, a social media giant, or it could be something as simple as your local grocery store app. But here's the thing. Within this big category of data fiduciaries, there's a special group.
Okay.
They're called significant data fiduciaries, or SDS for short.
SDFs.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of intimidating.
Well, they are the big players, you could say.
All right.
Handling huge amounts of sensitive data, the kind of data that could impact national security, public order, big stuff. Think Google, Meta, major banks, that kind of level. And because what they do has wider implications, the rules hold them to a higher standard.
So it's like different levels of responsibility depending on how much data you're handling and how sensitive it is.
Exactly. And this distinction, regular fiduciaries versus SDFs, it's the kind of detail they might throw at you in an exam question.
Okay, good to know. Got to pay attention to the nuances.
Absolutely.
Now, there's something else I've been seeing a lot in these rules is this big emphasis on consent. And there's this term consent managers. What are they all about?
So the whole idea behind the DPDP Act is to give individuals more control over their data, right?
Right.
Consent managers are like independent referees in the data game. They're separate entities that are going to be managing consent records, making sure that when you give consent, you're doing it freely, you understand what you're agreeing to, and you can take it back just as easily.
So like if I'm signing up for a new app, the consent manager steps in to make sure the app is playing by the rules, explaining what data they're collecting, how they're going to use it.
Exactly. Adding that layer of accountability, which is super important these days because you know how it is. Our data is constantly being collected, used in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Okay, so consent managers, they're the referees, got it.
Right.
Now, there's one topic in these rules that's causing a lot of buzz, and that's data localization. Can you give us a quick breakdown of what it is and why it's so controversial?
Sure. Data localization basically means keeping certain types of personal data within India, no transferring it outside the country.
Okay.
The government gets to decide which data falls under this, but you can bet things like sensitive personal data, anything related to national security, that's definitely going to be on the list.
Makes sense from a, sovereignty perspective, but I can see why global tech companies might not be thrilled.
You're right, they haven't been shy about voicing their concerns. Companies like Meta and Google, they're worried about how this will impact their operations, their services in India. They say it's going to make things more complex, more expensive.
Wouldn't it also give India more control over its citizens' data and potentially, reduce the risks of foreign surveillance and all that?
Absolutely. That's the other side of the coin. Data localization, it's all about finding that balance.
Right.
Data sovereignty and security on one hand, the free flow of information in our globalized digital world on the other.
This is like a real-world case study for those UPSC ethics and governance papers.
You got it. Weighing different values, seeing how they play out in policy decisions. That's what the UPSC is all about.
Okay, so data localization, definitely a topic to dig into, understand all the angles.
Definitely.
Now, let's shift gears a bit. What happens if a company, messes up? Let's say there's a data breach. What are the consequences under these new rules?
Oh, they're not messing around when it comes to data breaches. Any breach, big or small, has to be reported immediately to the authorities and to the people affected. And it can't just be a vague, oops, something happened. The rules are very specific about what needs to be reported, like the nature of the breach, when it happened, what steps were taken to contain it, all of that.
And I'm guessing there's some pretty serious penalties for companies that try to sweep things under the rug.
You bet. We're talking fines that could go as high as 250 crore rupees. That gets attention.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of money. Definitely motivates companies to take data protection seriously. But what about the government itself? They handle a ton of our data. Are there specific rules for how they can use our information?
That's a great point, and you're right, it's a sensitive area. The draft rules address this directly, actually. It's all about finding that balance again between national security and individual privacy rights.
So even the government can't just access and use our data freely. There are safeguards, specific reasons they need to have.
Exactly. The rules lay out those safeguards very clearly. Even the government needs a legitimate reason to access our data, and it has to be done lawfully and transparently.
That's good to know. It's reassuring to know there are those checks and balances in place. This has been super insightful, and I'm sure our listeners are taking notes. We've covered a lot already, the DPDP Act, data fiduciaries, consent managers, even that whole data localization debate. But there's still so much more to unpack, right?
You're right. We're just getting started. Stick with us. We'll be back with more in-depth analysis after the break.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
So before the break, we were talking about how these draft rules handle the government's own data use, right?
Yeah, it's super interesting, isn't it?
Oh, it is.
Because on one hand, obviously the government needs data for national security, for all sorts of things. But on the other hand, our individual privacy is important too. So how do these rules kind of navigate that tension?
Well, they actually build on a landmark judgment, one that any UPSC aspirant should know, the Puttaswamy case.
Oh, yeah. It was a huge deal because it affirmed the right to privacy as a fundamental right in India. And these rules, they're taking that principle and applying it specifically to our digital lives, making sure the government can't just access our data without a good reason.
So, connecting legal precedents to current events. Classic UPSC move.
Exactly.
Now, let's flip the script for a second and look at all this from a business perspective.
Yeah.
These rules seem pretty comprehensive. A lot to take in. Won't companies, especially smaller ones, struggle to adapt?
There are definitely going to be challenges, no doubt.
Yeah.
The consent management system alone is going to require some serious changes.
Right.
Think about it. Companies need robust systems to record consent, verify it, manage it all at scale, and they have to make sure it's all transparent for users. It's not a small feat.
And it's not just about getting consent upfront, right? There's the whole data retention thing, too. Companies can't just hold on to data forever.
Exactly. Data can only be kept for as long as there's a valid reason, either ongoing consent or a legitimate purpose. After that, it has to be deleted. It's a big change for companies that are used to hoarding data, just in case.
Yeah, just in case. And then, of course, there's data localization, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
storing certain data only within India that has logistical implications, cost implications, especially for these big global companies.
Oh, absolutely. They might need to set up new data centers in India, which is a massive investment. And it's not just the money either.
Right.
There needs to be a real understanding of the rules within these companies.
Yeah.
Training employees, updating privacy policies, making data protection a core part of how they do business.
So it's a cultural shift as much as a technological one.
You could say that, but let's be real, some companies might be tempted to cut corners, What's stopping them?
Right. Good point. Are there strong enforcement mechanisms in place? Something to make sure everyone takes this seriously.
Well, the penalties for noncompliance are pretty hefty. Remember those 250 crore rupee fines we talked about?
Yeah, that's a lot.
And it's not just companies. Even consent managers, if they mess up repeatedly, they could lose their registration. So the message is pretty clear. Take data protection seriously or face the consequences.
The consequences are definitely one way to get people's attention. But beyond the legal stuff, the fines, these rules have a wider impact, don't they?
Absolutely. They're shaping the future of India's digital economy. If India wants to be a global leader in this space, strong data protection is essential.
How so?
It builds trust,
Yeah.
Trust among citizens, trust among businesses. It shows India is serious about protecting data, both within the country and internationally.
Trust, yeah, that's key. It's not just about ticking the boxes, it's about creating an ethical, trustworthy data ecosystem.
Exactly. And for all those UPSC aspirants out there, this links directly to so many important topics. Digital governance, ethics and technology, even India's role in shaping global internet norms. It's essay gold, I'm telling you.
You're making me want to grab my notebook and start brainstorming right now.
Do it. But one thing to remember, these are draft rules.
Right.
Things could change. So pay attention to the discussions, the debates that happen as these rules get finalized. Analyzing different perspectives, that's what makes exam answers stand out. It shows you're not just regurgitating facts, but really engaging with these complex issues.
Okay, good advice. Now let's circle back to those concerns that big tech companies like Meta and Google have raised, especially about data localization.
Sure.
They're saying it's going to add a lot of complexity, cost to their operations, might even impact the services they offer in India. And they're also raising concerns about data security, saying storing data in multiple locations is actually safer.
Right, right. They argue that having backups, redundancy, it actually enhances security.
But on the other hand, you have the argument that data localization gives India more control, more oversight over its citizens' data.
Exactly. And could help prevent, foreign surveillance and all that. And it's a real dilemma, isn't it?
It is. And it makes it a really interesting area to study for the UPSC because you need to understand both sides of the argument, be able to present a balanced, well-reasoned analysis.
Exactly. Don't just pick a side. Break it down. Show the examiners you understand the nuances, the complexities.
This is giving me flashbacks to those critically analyzed questions we used to get in the mains exams.
Oh, I know those questions. And this whole data localization debate, it's a perfect example of how real-world stuff becomes prime material for those tough UPSC questions.
So just to recap, we've talked about how companies need to adapt, the challenges they might face, the enforcement side of things, those concerns from the big tech players. And of course, we've tied it all back to your UPSC prep. I think we're starting to get a pretty good grasp of just how significant these draft rules are.
Definitely. But remember, this is just one piece of the puzzle. India's digital landscape is always evolving, right? There are other policies, other initiatives happening, all shaping how data is used, protected, the whole ecosystem.
Right. It's a constantly shifting landscape.
Exactly. So keep learning, keep exploring, and stick around for our final segment, where we'll wrap up this whole deep dive with some, I think, pretty thought-provoking questions.
Sounds good. I'm ready for it. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've spent quite a bit of time now, really exploring these draft DPDP rules. And I got to say, it feels like a pretty big moment for data protection in India.
Oh, absolutely. We've covered so much ground already. The basics of the DPDP Act, consent management, that whole data localization debate, all stuff that's like essential knowledge for those UPSC exams.
For sure. But now, as we wrap things up, let's step back a bit.
Yeah.
Big picture time. What do these rules tell us about, the direction data protection is heading in India?
Well, I think they signal a pretty clear shift, a shift towards really prioritizing data privacy.
Okay.
These rules are comprehensive. They lay out responsibilities for everyone involved, from the biggest tech companies to the government itself.
And it's not just about protection, is it? It's also about giving individuals more control over their own data.
Right.
Like the focus on consent, data portability, that really puts individuals in the driver's seat.
Exactly. No more blindly clicking agree on those terms and conditions, you know?
Those endless terms and conditions.
Yeah.
People will actually have more transparency, more say in how their data is used.
It's about time.
It really is. But even with all these, these strong rules in place, there are bound to be challenges along the way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, India's digital scene is huge, it's complex, it's constantly changing.
Oh, for sure. Think about the resources that'll be needed for enforcement, making sure everyone's following the rules.
Right.
Or, there might be legal challenges from companies that don't like certain parts of the rules, try to push back.
And we can't forget about the awareness part, right? People need to understand their rights.
Absolutely.
And companies need to, stay up to date on what they need to do.
Yeah.
Education on both sides is key.
You're hitting all the right points. And for all our future civil servants out there, this is where those analytical skills come in handy.
Yeah.
Can you identify the potential roadblocks, the challenges to actually implementing these rules? Can you, really assess how effective different parts of the rules might be? Maybe even suggest improvements. That's the kind of thinking that UPSC examiners love to see.
It's about going deeper, right? Not just memorizing the rules, but showing you can think critically about what they actually mean in the real world. That's what separates, the good answers from the great answers in those UPSC exams.
Exactly. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to chew on.
Okay, hit me with it.
How will these new data protection rules impact India's competitiveness in the global digital economy?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Will they attract investment?
Yeah.
Foster innovation, or will they end up creating, unnecessary barriers and stifle growth? It's a big question, and there's no easy answer.
It's something that, all of us, especially those aiming for those top positions in the government, we're going to have to think about.
It's complex. It has long-term implications, not just for India's economy, but for, the whole global digital landscape.
Well, this has been a fantastic starting point for anyone wanting to understand this topic. We've covered so much ground.
We have, but this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep exploring, and to all our UPSC aspirants out there, best of luck with your preparation.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. If you found this episode insightful, please hit that subscribe button and share it with your friends. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into fascinating topics that matter. Until then, stay curious and keep learning.